So thanks again for joining our first edition of the ICPD Talk series. Today's conversation will be entitled 30 Years of ICPD, an Intergenerational Conversation on Bodily Autonomy. My name is Leila Sharafi. I'm the Chief of the Gender and Human Rights Branch here in UNFPA's Technical Division. And I welcome you to this event. But before we get started, a few housekeeping announcements. This event is being recorded, and we're providing simultaneous interpretation into Spanish and French. So in order to activate your interpretation, please click on the globe icon, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, then select the language that you prefer. So if you could just take a few seconds to enable the language of your choice, that would be great. There is an option called Mute Original Audio. Do not select this because then you will miss some parts of the audio. So just select the language that you prefer. If you have any questions or comments, please share them in the Q&A function, which you'll also find at the bottom toolbar. We will have a dedicated Q&A segment, but you can go ahead and put your questions in there and we'll get to those questions and ask our panelists to respond during the segment dedicated to the discussion. We have an exciting program ahead of us today. We'll first open up with some welcome remarks, followed by a conversation with our four guests, after which we'll open up for Q&A. 30 years of an ICPD, an intergenerational conversation on bodily autonomy, is intended to bring us together as we reflect on 3 decades since the landmark Programme of Action came into being. Very quickly, just to say before I hand over for opening remarks, we know from SDG data that the world is not on track to meet SDGs, including SDG 5. We know that only 44% of partnered women worldwide still cannot make their own decisions about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and legal and regulatory barriers stand in the way of many to exercise their bodily autonomy. Against this backdrop of declining investments in SRHR, regressive laws, rising conservatism, rising harmful effects of technology, and climate change, which are factors that are further compounding the gender equality and reproductive health and rights crisis. With that said, let's kick off the program today, and I'm very delighted to welcome now Mr. Ian McFarlane, Director at UNFPA's Division for Communications and Strategic Partnerships. Ian, thank you so much for being here with us today. And over to you now to provide us with some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Leila. Hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to welcome each and every one of you. I'm not on mute. Sorry,
that was me. Go ahead.
So I can say again, it's really great to welcome everybody here, each and every one of you. Thank you so much for taking some time to join us today for this first ICPD 30 Let's Talk event. It's our humble effort by UNFPA to create a space to reflect on ICPD 30 years after Cairo. And we've launched this series. There will be several more conversations. We've launched this in an effort to engage and stimulate dialogue with our civil society partners around pertinent issues of ICPD. And that includes unpacking priority issues raised by many of you during the regional conferences on population and development that took place in your regions last year. We hope this becomes a space for you to share your valuable insights and reflections and expertise and build momentum, set the stage for a renewed commitment to ICPD at the heart of delivering on those sustainable development goals that Leila mentioned in her opening. It was civil society, in fact, young leaders and feminists who ignited the movement at Cairo 30 years ago, leading to a remarkable global consensus that reaffirmed the rights of women and girls as central to development. It demonstrated then the power of social movements, particularly inclusive feminist movements, coming together to demand better, to demand more for women and girls around the world. We've come a long way. All of us have come a long way together since 1994, but just not enough. We hope that despite the adoption of covenants and conventions, ambitious goals for women and girls around the world, it is still a very grim world in terms of their rights and choices. That fundamental right to make decisions over their own bodies and futures is still not fully realized. We're also cognizant of a shrinking civil society space and those difficult new issues that Layla referred to in terms of online and offline. The reality for women and girls is not where it should be. And civil society is not able to play its full role. So from UNFPA, we hope that we can support you in your role as part of the movement to bring around a better world for women and girls everywhere. The 30th anniversary of ICPD is a great moment to reflect, to celebrate, to think forward as to how we can adapt to a world in which we have population anxieties, where we have pushback in terms of the rights and choices of women. Today, as Layla said, we have a really amazing panel who will be sharing their experiences and their insights. We hope you'll be inspired to ask more questions and to activate wherever you are to make this series and its contribution to the wider global debate for women and girls better and more impactful. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today and the ongoing energy around driving forward for ICPD 30. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have an inspiring session today. Layla, thank you again, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and we really appreciate you framing this discussion for us today and kicking us off, and also sharing UNFPA's vision for these ICPD talks. And now we'll kick off our exciting conversation with our four esteemed guests, who I'll briefly introduce before asking them their questions. We're honored to welcome Dr. Geeta Sen, Senior Advisor and Distinguished Professor of the Ramalingueswamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health at Public Health Foundation of India. Dr. Sen's research and lifelong advocacy on health and population, gender and development, and inequality have served as a pivotal contribution to this field of work. We're very excited to welcome you, Dr. Sen. We're also joined by Eunice Garcia, Executive Director of the Youth Coalition on Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Eunice is from Mexico and has a background in human rights law with a focus on defending the rights of excluded populations. Welcome, Eunice. We're also pleased to welcome our very own Sarah Craven, Chief of UNFPA's North America office based in Washington, D.C. Sarah has worked on advocacy campaigns and been a lifelong champion of empowering women and girls, including ending harmful practices. Prior to her work at UNFPA, she held positions at the U.S. Department of State and on legislative staff to U.S. senators. And finally, we're joined by Lobosile Masinga, founder and chairperson of the Pink Roses Foundation, an organization based in South Africa which focuses on improving access and information to sexual and reproductive health and rights and services to young people with disabilities. Lobosile is a leader from the youth movement and is a UNFPA Youth Advisory Panel member and Young African Leadership Initiative alumni. We welcome you all today. And now over to our first guest for their first, well, to all of our guests for their first round of questions. My first question goes to Dr. Geeta Sen. Dr. Sen, welcome. For over 3 decades, you've worked nationally and internationally on population policies, reproductive and sexual health, gender equality, and women's human rights, as well as poverty and issues related to human development. Your work has helped to shape the global paradigm on population and development. And the organization you co-founded, Dawn, was part of the women's movement at the ICPD in '94. And we know that the women's movement was instrumental, as Ian also mentioned in the opening, to the adoption of the historic ICPD. So my question to you is, going into that meeting in '94, what were your hopes and aspirations? And what would you say were some of the key factors that led to the adoption of such a progressive, forward-looking agenda? Over to you, Dr. Sen.
Thanks very much, Layla. and thank you for inviting me to the first in these series for ICPD 30. It's a little hard for me to believe that it's been 30 years since those days when we were in the sands in Cairo, as a movement sort of breaking new ground, but often not quite sure of our footing, because none of us had ever negotiated at the United Nations before then. So we were learning by the seat of our pants as we went along, so to speak. You asked what our hopes and aspirations were going into ICPD. I suppose the hopes and aspirations of people who have nothing. And when people have nothing, it does two things. One is it takes your aspirations sky high. You can ask for the moon, you can fight for anything. And the second thing it does is that you're not afraid of losing anything because you don't have anything. And in a sense, for a movement that represented 50% of the world's population, that was both at sometimes an ironic and humbling situation, but also one that filled us with great possibilities and potential for change. So what were some of the factors that went into it? And I was trying to think about these. There's a paper that Sonia Correa, Adrian Germain, and I did for a book published by Ellen Chesler and Ellen Chesler and another co-editor called Women Rising, which sort of looked back. That book came out in 2016. So it looked back and said, okay, now in hindsight, what do we see as having been factors that played an important role? The first, of course, was that the feminist movement, the women's movement, women's organizations had been criticizing top-down population policies for a very long time. And in places like, particularly in Latin America, that critique of population policies, which came largely from the Asian side, was complemented by the struggle for safe abortion, human rights of women and girls, and from sisters in Africa who were very concerned about the fact that, in fact, they had so little by way of services, whether for contraception or for health more generally. So that critique had been in existence, but what we needed to do was to now take that critique out of our own circles into a much bigger arena. It wasn't just safe abortion that was excluded, as we know at that time, safe abortion services. RTIs and STIs, there was hardly any knowledge about them in those days. Violence against women and girls, barely on the agenda. Female genital mutilation, hardly anyone speaking about it. And child marriage. It's a little hard to think about when you look back and say, really? Is that possible that it wasn't being talked about? No, it wasn't. And that gives you a sense of how far we've come in 30 years. So what were some of the, I will mention three things that were really important. The first was we had to build a consolidated base for our political action. And pretty much through the 1970s and a good part of the 1980s, building that base for action in terms of persuading our own groups, our allies, our friends, our partners, as well as government officials, health departments, about the need to recognize how serious the problems were of women's reproductive and sexual health and rights. Although we didn't quite have that language yet, was a very important thing. So there were almost, I would say, 2 decades of that kind of just basic building the base for political action work. In a sense, you could say, I said we hardly were using the language. The language of reproductive rights actually came into the public arena from a meeting that the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights held in Amsterdam in as late as 1984. And that language was not even in existence or being widely used, certainly, by that time. The second big thing we had to do was to create intellectual capital, the evidence, the concepts, the ideas that could come together as in a kind of coherent manner that we could then put forward in order to say, here's an agenda, here's a program that we need everyone to get behind. As I said, there was the concepts and the language of reproductive rights, reproductive health, reproductive rights. There was the critique of population control. I remember the work of my own organization, DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, on bringing the challenges of population, coerced population control onto the public arena. We also engaged with the Northern environmentalists at UNCED, the very first big 1992 environmental conference, with the Northern environmentalists saying, don't blame population growth in the South for the problems in the environment. It has more to do with the consumption of the rich than the numbers of human bodies in existence. So that was a very big engagement. And the third very important element of that building, creating intellectual capital, was working with sympathizers within key institutions and organizations such as the World Health Organization, UNFPA, and others. And I recall, and I would like to pay my tribute to Dr. Mahmoud Fathallah, who passed away sadly a few months ago, at the WHO, who played a stellar role in putting our issues into the agenda of the World Health Organization. But there were others, Anibal Faundes in Brazil, Jose Barzelato, and there were many who played a crucial role in showing us in the feminist movement, in the women's groups, how we needed to work with institutions to influence programs, policy directions, and very importantly, research agendas. Do I have a minute more, Leila, for a couple more comments?
Yes, please, Gita.
Sure. So we went forward from this. This was happening, I would say, in the 1980s, very strongly. We said, okay, population policy as it is traditionally understood, top-down and coercive often, is a real problem. So how can we create something called a feminist population policy? Later on, we stopped talking about it in that way, but we did talk at that time about the need for a feminist population policy. which would have a minimum package. And that minimum package included safe, voluntary, quality contraceptive services for everyone, safe abortion, safe and legal abortion services for everyone, prenatal obstetric and postpartum care for all pregnant women and people who needed them. Remember, maternal mortality was very, very high at that time. STI and HIV prevention and treatment, and comprehensive sexuality education. Now, as you can see, there were very important things in this minimum package, but it also didn't include a bunch of things which we would immediately think of right now. Violence against women and girls being one of them, for instance. The rights-linked agenda on protecting and promoting human rights was not so much part of this package, because we were talking about a policy package of services at that time. In 9 months before ICPD, the women's movement came together in Rio in January of 1994, and there was over 200 of us from a very, very large number of organizations from, I think, around 80 countries, who came together to say, okay, can we agree on a common platform, a women's platform for ICPD? And to do this, we needed to work through what were at that time some very important fault lines among ourselves. And those were fault lines along a south-north divide, or as we used to call it, a third world, first world divide at that time, with some people from countries, including some from India, from the Philippines, and others, saying that this reproductive rights agenda is a northern agenda, and we need a much broader agenda than that. That meeting in Rio was crucial in building the basis for our ability to work together. And finally, it is what then made the ICPD Programme of Action one of the most important in its time in terms of the things it had to say about development more broadly, about such things as poverty, north-south inequalities, debt, and so on as well. And then we produced evidence. Now, we were on a very steep learning curve in terms of UN negotiations. And at the negotiations in Cairo itself, we had an inside-outside strategy. And we had a very large number of feminists on delegations, official delegations, so that we had our friends there as well with whom we could interact and talk. And we were laser focused, as my departed friend Adrian would say, we were laser focused on the outcome document, the actual negotiations on language in the outcome document. What didn't we get? One of the important things that we didn't explicitly get was sexual rights. The explicit language of sexual rights is not there in the ICPD Programme of Action. But in the negotiations, sexual rights was bartered for 42 paragraphs on adolescent health and rights. And so we were going to get one or the other. And probably we may have ended up with neither at that time. But the negotiators of that time can tell you that since nobody was talking about adolescence at that time, and we got the entire section on adolescence in exchange for not having explicit language on sexual rights. We were, of course, committed then to taking that fight into the Beijing conference the next year, which is, of course, what we did. I'll stop with that.
Wow, fantastic, Gita. Can't thank you enough for giving us that rich historical context, which really helps us today as we think 30 years on and facing all the challenges. History does in some way repeat itself. Thank you for bringing up those three key aspects that you said were important ingredients, so to speak, critiquing the population policies. I love that, creating intellectual capital and really working with sympathizers across the ecosystem, and your inside-outside strategy in Cairo, having the large number of feminists, right, on official delegations. It's really remarkable, and you can really see that history leading us to that progressive document, though albeit, some things, as you say, didn't quite make it in. But I'll come back to your thoughts on sort of the future and what you think going forward. But thank you so much. Shifting now to Eunice. Eunice, your organization, the Youth Coalition on Sexual and Reproductive Rights, advocates for the bodily autonomy of young people, particularly those marginalized by different oppressive systems. So my question to you is, what are some of the ways in which young people are helping to address some of those barriers to exercising their bodily autonomy? And through your work, how have you helped build those bridges, particularly across social justice movements? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me today. And thank you so much for like to Gita for all the historic explanation, because I think that it is very relevant for the younger generations to also understand the struggles that our ancestors have had, so that we can actually continue the fight. And about the question that you just asked, Leila, I think that one of the most relevant things that we have done is to build an understanding of what does bodily autonomy mean and all the intersection that it has, beyond what it has been mainstreamed in many ways as the right to choose on reproductive matters, and beyond only like being able to consent to sex. As Youth Coalition and as part of the youth movement, we have been working on understanding bodily autonomy from a holistic perspective, particularly understanding how all the systems of oppression interact and prevent young people to actually making decisions. In 2021, when we were developing the blueprint for the generation equality for the Action Coalition on Bodily Autonomy and SRHR, different partners, including UNFPA, supported the Youth Coalition to host different conversation with different groups of young people to understand what were the barriers that they were facing when trying to exercise bodily autonomy and decision making. And it was very clear for us to see across all of these groups that were indigenous young people, LGBTQI young people, young sex workers, young people with disabilities, all of them were highlighting the same systems of oppression over and over as the main barriers to exercising bodily autonomy. So for us, it was very clear that that it was very necessary to address those, and to address those in a way that is like in a cross movement way. For us, it has also been very important to, as I was mentioning, like understanding bodily autonomy from this holistic perspective. For example, what's the relationship between the body and the territory, and how this is also understood and addressed by the climate justice movement, by the indigenous movement, by the peace and security movement. We're seeing this right now with what's happening in Gaza, how it is very important to link the body and the territory, the bodies and the context. Like the bodies are not just like a standing alone thing. We exist in community. We exist in different contexts. We exist in an environment and in a context. For us, it has also been super important. And for example, like in other like in conversations with other people, with the anti-racist movement, with the drugs movements. What we have seen, for example, is like the militarization of security has an impact in the way in which young people can make decisions on their own. Economic empowerment also has a very big impact in how young people can make decisions on their bodies. And also understanding that bodily autonomy is not only, as I was mentioning, about like making decisions about whether you want to have kids or not, and how many kids you want to have, or whether you can actually consent to sexual practices or not, but it goes beyond that. It goes, it should address like how you want to relate yourself with other people, how you want to build your relationships, how do you want to live your life without any type of patriarchal or racist or colonial impositions. And all of that is very important for young people. I think that also one of the things that we have done and that we have championed in these past years is building inclusive and participatory processes so that young people can actually engage in meaningful conversations that center their needs and their lived experiences around decision making. Because as Gita, I think that this is super related to what Gita was mentioning about like this top-down policies that are created in like without actually recognizing who should be centering these conversations. And decolonizing the way in which we understand expertise is crucial, because there is no one knows and no one understands better the context and the struggles of young people than young people themselves. I also think that providing information to young people on their rights and democratizing legal frameworks so that young people can understand their rights and the obligations of the state has been crucial. And for this, for example, one of the cool things that we have done with UNFPA has been building a toolkit on bodily autonomy so that young people can have information that is simple in terms of what are all of the rights that are around bodily autonomy and that are included in bodily autonomy. What are the rights that young people are entitled to as preconditions to make decisions? How are we equipping them with information that they need? How do we think and how do we link the information that they receive with the services that are youth responsive? So for example, we had like we created this toolkit on bodily autonomy, and we created a specific toolkit on how do young people with disabilities understand bodily autonomy under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And for us, it was very important to center the voices of young people with disabilities when they were talking about the systems of oppression that affect their lives, around like ableism. How does ableism really materializes in their everyday life, and how does ableism and ageism and racism and colonialism and all of these impositions materialize when they are trying to access information, when they are trying to access services, when they are trying to actually make decisions on their own. And I think that that has been one of the most important things that we have done. And also cross-movement alliances is extremely important. As a youth coalition, we have seen how, as I was mentioning, the climate justice movement of young people connects with the movement of young people working on SRHR, and how the indigenous people that are defending lives and that are defending territories is also extremely connected to the struggles of young people seeking economic empowerment and fighting capitalist impositions, and how all of these systems are always like what young people are complaining about as the main barriers for them to be able to live their lives as they want, which is at the end, that's bodily autonomy. And that's why we have been building these cross-movement alliances a lot with the support of UNFPA, with the Global Network of Young People with Disabilities, but also with other movements like the anti-racist movement, the climate justice movement, the indigenous movement, the LGBTQI movement. And for us, it's very important that all of these are connected and to strengthen them all in the same way so that we can all fight together to achieve bodily autonomy. Thank you, Leila.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eunice. I really appreciated how you talked about your work with young people in terms of broadening this concept of bodily autonomy and how it really is connected to so many different aspects of life. But I like that body and territory, body in the community, decolonizing expertise, creating spaces for inclusion and participation. Really powerful. Thank you so much. So shifting to Sarah now, Sarah Craven. You attended the ICPD conference in Cairo in 1994 as an NGO advocate, and later you joined UNFPA. So my question to you is, could you reflect on your experience at the meeting? How has UNFPA worked to elevate the importance of agency and choice and women's decision-making for SRHR through its work? Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Leila. This has been such a great presentation, and Gita, I just want to say thank you so much for bringing back so many memories. I've been like furiously taking notes as I remember different aspects of things. When Leila asked me to be on this, I thought, intergenerational, I can't believe I'm now on the top end of being intergenerational, and being 30 years ago, I certainly was on the side of being youth, but now I'm very happy to reflect back on that time. I think one thing I really want to emphasize is that was such a cultural moment. 1994 was a moment in the world. It was the year that Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president in South Africa. It was a moment where the UN was focusing in these series of international conferences. Cairo came after. There was a conference in Copenhagen on social development. There was the Rio Environmental Conference. You had the Cairo conference and Beijing moving on. And it was really such a massive cultural worldwide flashpoint. Again, kind of reflecting back on this, as Gita mentioned, the demographic top-down approach. I remember one of the first meetings I went to was with some of the feminist leaders that Gita referred to, Adrienne Germain, Joan Dunlop, and there was a former American member of Congress named Bella Abzug, who was very famous because she always wore these giant hats. And Bella had a bumper sticker that was from an NGO that said, "How dense can we be?" And I remember her holding up that bumper sticker like, this is what we're addressing, this whole idea of density, population, demography, that kind of being the place we were pre-Cairo and where the vision was to move forward onto that rights-based piece. Key to this, I really think, was UNFPA and really the leadership of Dr. Nafis Siddique. Nafis was quite an extraordinary leader. She was an accomplished OBGYN, but she was really a political leader, and she really took that moment to really see that this was the time that the UN and UNFPA would like open the doors to have civil society be there in a very engaged way. And I really reflect on when Gita said like people were figuring it out as they went. I was part of a network called the SEDPA network, and I know Esther Corona is on the call today. I want to give a shout out to Esther. The SEDPA network was really a network of women leaders who were, and men, some men, but they were more people who were actually running programs. They didn't see themselves as feminists per se. They didn't see themselves as advocates, but through the process, they became those kind of leaders and those kind of advocates. And I think that was sort of one of the incredible benefits of the way the process went for the ICPD, was building that kind of leadership. And one of my favorite stories was that there were all these prep comms, and as Gita said, the language was very intense and very protracted on certain issues, particularly on the issue around abortion. So we had a delegation through the SEDPA network of 3 very young advocates, doctors from Romania. And prior to that time, contraception had been illegal in Romania, and it had just been legalized. And there was a lot of mistrust or misunderstanding for contraception in Romania because of years of policies that were very pronatal, and really women only ways they had to space births was through access to abortion. So these 3 advocates, I mean, they weren't even advocates, they were people who were like running programs in Romania, were suddenly put in this leadership role. And they got there and there was a Romanian delegation of all men, and they were super intimidated by these men who were running the delegation. And through this various PrepCom process, it was just amazing to watch, because suddenly the Romanian delegation were turning to these women leaders and asking them for talking points, or asking them, how can we, what should we be doing as an intervention? And by the time we got to Cairo, one of those advocates, Dr. Borbalacu, was actually on the official Romanian delegation to the ICPD. And when you looked at every delegation, it all had civil society participants in it, because that was seen that this wasn't just for governments, that was also for civil society to be part of that shaping of the dialogue. The other piece, when I was like thinking about this today, when I was saying like what a cultural moment it was, the Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, came to this meeting. And if you really want to go down in history, I've just rewatched his speech. I printed it out, 5 pages, single spaced, which really kind of was that, if you read it, it's really that kind of dichotomy between the concerns of environmentalists, the demography piece, and then also this nascent piece on rights, choices, the need to empower women and girls. He starts out his speech by saying, this is the most important conference that was ever held. And I think that's really what I want to say is, for 30 years later, there's much we have to achieve. There's much we have to still address. But the legacy of that cosmic shift 30 years ago is what we're still here today talking about. And I think that's what's so powerful, and what I hope as we continue this conversation that we talk about is how we continue to like go back into that history and rechannel that idea of that it wasn't just governments, that it was a broad-based coalition of civil society, of young people, all working together with that common vision, and that we still have that vision today, and how do we build and move it forward? Over.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks so much. Really, I think Dr. Nafis Saadik's leadership was certainly something that we still reflect on in UNFPA, and really a demonstration of such a strong leader who really, took this moment of this, as you called it, the cultural, and I would say, as you've described, political moment. And I love the way you described it, right? It's a legacy of that cosmic shift. And it was a cosmic shift. We are still talking about it 30 years later, but really recognizing, and I think many of you have said, that it really was a broad-based coalition that enabled that common vision to come to be a reality. Thank you so much. I'm going to now turn to Robesile, who is here with us, and you have founded the Pink Roses organization, which aims to improve access and information to sexual and reproductive health and rights and services to young people with disabilities. I'd like to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about some of the discrimination that young people with disabilities face, and how organizations like yours are enabling a space for these young people to advocate and really be change agents for sexual and reproductive health, including bodily autonomy. So over to you. Do we have her with us? Did she drop? Okay, we can come back to Robesile in a moment. What I can do now is shift over to our second round, and then hopefully we'll be able to connect back with Robesile. So I'm going to go back to Gita now. Gita, looking back on the last 3 decades, what do you think the ICPD Programme of Action really has helped us achieve? You talked about how it really came into being, but then, those achievements, but then what more would you like to see going forward, given all of the challenges that we have pointed out and are going on and increasing day by day? Over to you, Gita.
Sure. Thanks, Lila. And I sure hope Robesile will come back, because I was really looking forward to hearing what she had to say. Major achievements. Of course, we've all talked endlessly about the paradigm change that came about. I gave you a little bit of a flavor of that when I named a whole bunch of ideas, concepts, data, evidence, which we now take for granted, and which simply was not anywhere on anybody's agenda except ours prior to that time. So first is the big change in language and concepts. Just to give you a flavor of that. And in prior to the 90s, prior to ICPD, if gender equality or women or women's fertility was spoken about at all, it would be in population policy literature. The main question was something like this. Okay, I'm caricaturing a bit, but not too much. Is it women's education or income that leads to lower fertility? A lot of interest in that question. So the interest in women was as instrumental to the reduction of population growth. It was not about health or rights. It was not about women per se at all. So it gives you a sense of the mindset change that happened post with ICPD. The second is lots of institutions changed. National level institutions that shifted, even if partially or inadequately. And let me say one thing about that. The ICPD Programme of Action is not a magic wand. It's the product of a process of struggle. And no one ever said that the creation of a program of action of that kind would somehow be like waving a magic wand and voila, everything would change in terms of women's experiences on the ground. That required ongoing battles, struggles, engagement, advocacy, and hard work, which many people have been doing since then. But the words were important. The paradigm changed because it gave us a language within which to think and within which to frame what we saw as being needed. And policies shifted, policies changed as well. But I want to focus on a couple of other things which I think changed as a result of ICPD, which I think were very important. ICPD fueled new protagonists. And what Eunice said, speaking from the Youth Coalition, about the importance of young people coming in, the importance of their beginning to speak and think about bodily autonomy in very different ways, and the taking for granted that there should not be top-down imposition of policies and programs coming from a whole new generations of people. That I think was fueled by ICPD itself, because ICPD itself was a product of that kind of popular mobilization. So that I think was very important. And a second thing that it fueled, which Eunice also spoke about, and which I hope our other speaker will get a chance to tell us about, was diversity. In as much as ICPD spoke a little bit about diversity, it didn't. Diversity has come in a big way since then. And I think we'll see that in the 2024 UNFPA State of the World's Population report, which is very strongly focused on inequality and diversity, and which should be coming out in the next few months, should we say. I've been involved in it as an external advisor, And I think it's a very, very exciting, it's one of the most exciting reports that UNFPA has produced in recent times. So I'm giving you a pre-warning with a spoiler alert thrown in. And this focus on new protagonists, movements upwards, and diversity came from the fact that ICPD actually was so rights-focused, human rights-focused, and human rights-based. That was its biggest difference from what was there before. The specifics, the language, the details had to do with sexuality and reproduction. But the broader umbrella within which it was sitting was rights-based. And that's why it has made possible this fueling that has happened. But, and there are buts, and let me just emphasize the buts, because this is not all a positive story. Even at the time of ICPD, why did everybody have to come together? Because there was opposition. There was opposition from those who did not believe that women and men are equal, that from those who believe that women's primary role is as reproducers and as bearers of children and as those who take care of the home, from those who use such language of tradition or religion or belief systems in order to justify inequalities, to justify harmful practices, to justify tradition, when in the name of tradition, when those traditions actually in some cases simply didn't even exist as traditions, but got created as a process, as part of a process of controlling women, controlling those with divergent sexualities, controlling young people, controlling people with disabilities, controlling those who came from subordinated ethnic groups or racial groups or caste groups or backgrounds. It's all of those that ICPD was also a big victory against and a movement against. But that struggle has not gone away, as we know. We have a thriving and flourishing anti-gender movement today that does not believe in many of the things that ICPD and all of us stand for and believe in. Evangelism that in fact fuels anti-gender beliefs and as well as, sadly, laws and policies. And on the other side, the South-North divide that was bad enough at the time of ICPD has gotten much, much worse. And we see it on economic issues. Every economic issue. We see it in trade. When it came to the pandemic, we saw it in the global north fighting against a waiver on TRIPS flexibilities that would have made vaccines more easily and cheaply available in the global south. We see it on debt. We see it in austerity policies that are championed by northern-dominated institutions. And we also see it in such horrendous situations as the situation in Gaza. That North-South divide, our opponents, for instance, in the Holy See, have often used to cast themselves as the champions of the global South, except, of course, when it comes to the rights of women and girls and the rights of everybody in the global south, they're champions of, except us. And that's half the population. So, but that challenge of the South-North makes it very difficult. And Gaza has made it extremely difficult for those who champion human rights in the global south to accept that championing when it comes from the global north. Because people just turn around and say, yes, human rights, what about the Palestinians? And that, it's much, much more than a fault line. It's become a huge earthquake crack and fissure that is going to rip us apart. And that is a huge challenge for this movement, because for this movement in the global arena, we now really have to look at who our champions are. And that, I think, is one of our biggest challenges, is to be able to get to the recognition that human rights are indivisible, and that human rights to bodily autonomy and integrity cannot be realized without the human right to development and the human right to peace and a homeland of one's own. And this, I think, is crucial for us. The clear recognition of the indivisibility of human rights is important for us to be able to cement over our own internecine cracks and to make our movement truly decolonial. And I think that meaning, to take decolonialization from being just another nice word to its reality, we have to understand how colonialism operates today, not way back in the mists of the 19th and the 20th century, but right here and now in the 21st century. Those, I think, are the directions that I think our movement has to go, and where we need to build and build forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Geeta. Really just, talking about champions, recognizing that human rights are indivisible, the importance of diversity coming out more strongly in the last 30 years since ICPD, and really appreciated the historical context of fueling new protagonists and the importance of young people really coming through in these last years to stand up for their rights as something we've seen since ICPD. I'd like to now go back to Lobosile. We're running behind time, and I do see people putting questions in the chat, which I hope we'll get to. We may not, unfortunately, because I do want to go through a couple more reflections with the remaining speakers. So Lobosile, over to you, and hoping you're connected now. And just back to you on this question of some discrimination you've seen young people with disabilities face, and how organizations like yours are creating a space for young people to advocate and be change agents. Over to you.
Thanks, Leila. Hi, everyone who's listening. There's a lot of the whole point of the Pink Roses Foundation was strictly because of the discrimination that young people are facing, like specifically with disabilities, in terms of accessing sexual reproductive health rights. The first incident that actually introduced me to the whole need for advocating for sexual reproductive health services for young people with disabilities was when I was attending at the University of Zululand. I had a friend who was in a wheelchair, and we were going to the campus clinic that day, and for her, she was going for like contraceptive pills and stuff. And when we got there, the amount of questions, but like not really even nice questions, that were coming from not just like the general, like other students who were coming there to get the same things, but from the staff, the health staff, who were like, you're in a wheelchair. How come you want these pills? You should, like, it's just like people just automatically decide that young people with disabilities are asexual, and it just goes as far to some people even like deciding to take out reproductive health measures, measures for people with disabilities, like not giving them their right to their own bodily autonomy, or just making choices of what to do with their bodies. And the situation gets even worse for women of color, or Black women, and they who with disabilities. It Some get even as far as to face like gender-based. We're more prone to gender-based violence cases. Um, a lot of our young women are prone to facing sexual violence, either because of the people around them, or just being exposed to a really bad societal myth. For instance, um, in South Africa, people believe that people with albinism can cure, like sleeping with someone with albinism can cure HIV and stuff like that. So I'm more prone to sexual violence than the other person. So organizations like us try to sort of bridge the gap to between people with disabilities, or young people with disabilities, and the health care service providers, by first sensitizing healthcare service providers about the right language on how to help or cater to people with disabilities, and also helping them with making their spaces more accessible to people with disabilities, and not just with physical infrastructure, but by having advocating for having people who would aid those who are visually impaired to get around in their spaces when they can, having documents that are in different formats to cater for different visual impairments and stuff like that. Trying to have audio audiovisual equipment for to cater for any like specific needs, specifically like people who are hearing impaired. You could have like visual aids for them and stuff like that, to give them information on how to access your services and stuff like that. We also go to spaces where we can find people with disabilities and let them know about their sexual reproductive health rights. We tell them of where to access the services. We also tell them of how to actually advocate for themselves. We advocate for themselves in situations where they are met with stigmatization or discrimination due because of their disabilities, and maybe they don't have someone like me, or someone who works in disability rights and stuff like that right there. We try to equip them with as much knowledge and information on their rights to access to services and everything, so that they will in turn like be able to advocate for themselves. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And the importance of pointing out accessibility and the obligation that we all have to ensure that everything we do is accessible, but also importance of the services very much being accessible as well. And thank you for pointing out the real life situations, right, that young people with disabilities face in terms of egregious rights violations, but also just in terms of accessing services like contraception and the stigma they face. I'm going to turn to very quickly, since we've only got a few more minutes left and we do have a closing speaker, to Eunice and then to Sarah. But Eunice, if you could in a minute just tell us quickly, if you could just tell us very quickly what your key message to policymakers and decision makers would be for ensuring young people have a voice in these decisions, right? Especially when it comes to bodily autonomy. What would that one key message be?
Sure. Just very quickly before I go to that, I just want to say, like, Gita, please let's have a coffee someday. I could talk to you like for hours. Thank you so much for all of your reflections. Well, I think that I'm not sure I have one key message, but I think that like the message would be, first of all, like stop using the right to choose as a political tool, because what we are seeing, and this is something that Gita also mentioned about, like the situation in Gaza, we are seeing that many countries are using the right to choose and the gender agenda to as a political tool without recognizing that human rights are indivisible and that you cannot advocate for the rights of a population, but like not for the rights of all populations as a whole. So I think that that would be like one of the key messages that young people have. I also think that it is very important to understand gender beyond the binary, and that that's something that all the governments and all the decision making should start like really focusing on. Also, feminist financing principles. Like I think that many governments and like many decision makers are not putting or are not focusing or are not fulfilling the obligation to ensure that young people are able to exercise their right to political participation, because at the end young people have the right to political participation, and that is you can find that right in many political instruments, in many human rights instruments. So it's very important for young people that decision makers stop thinking about engaging young people as a thing of like, oh yeah, like we have to open space for diverse voices, and more about like, oh, like it is my obligation to ensure that young people have like can exercise the right to political participation. And that can only be done if spaces are youth friendly and youth responsive enough, and also if young people are resourced appropriately for like in order to be able to do this. So I think that those are some of the things that I want to mention. And also I just want to echo what Gita said about the importance of reflecting about the role of colonialism and the role of and I think that this is something that is very well explained in the report that Dr. T, the rapporteur on the right to health, did on colonialism and racism and different systems of oppression and the right to health and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and stop thinking of people with the capacity of getting pregnant as breeders for the capitalist world. So I think that that is also something super important to note. And yeah, with that I conclude. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Eunice. Sarah, quickly over to you. What would you say UNFPA is going to be doing to advocate for continued implementation of ICPD, but also achieving the SDGs?
In 1 minute. Okay. I just want to quickly, Gita said the ICPD is not a magic wand, but I do think it is an incredible, powerful tool that we can still use 30 years later. One of my favorite stories out of ICPD was a grassroots woman. I don't exactly remember what country she was from, but the story was that she got this giant van with a huge loudspeaker over it, and she drove it throughout her community, letting everyone know what their government had agreed to in Cairo. So I think what we have to do going forward, this conversation is such a great start to these talks. I think it's on UNFPA taking kind of like the most important pieces of legacy that came from Cairo and bringing it forward. One is ensuring the engagement and the voice of civil society. It's fantastic to have that voice here today, and we need to continue to engage that in true, meaningful, and real ways. I think the piece on adolescent girls is critical in terms of how we have to keep focusing on that in terms of both operationally and as advocates. Youth, Eunice, it's been so great to hear from you. I just want to give a shout out for the technical dialogue we're going to be doing in Benin. My understanding is it has been like, breaking the internet, how many people want to be at that meeting. And so I really hope for all my UNFPA colleagues here on that we find ways to ensure that that meeting goes beyond whoever the people who are there physically, that we build that network, because there is so much strong interest. And that's how we take this magic wand and move it forward. And then finally, just echoing thoughts on how we build the evidence base and how we ensure that there is financing for this work. Over.
Thank you. Not easy to sum up, but thank you so much, Sarah, for your thoughts on that. And then finally, before we close, and I see that Gita and others are answering the questions. Thank you so much. I wish we had all day for this. Really, I mean, we could really talk about many of these issues for much longer than we actually have allotted today. But finally, our last question to Obasile before we close and hand over to Arthur for closing remarks. Just a word from you on what more you would like to see in terms of making the work on SRHR more inclusive and having more meaningful participation.
I think firstly, we have a lot of policies that are great. I think it's now time to focus on like implementing them. By not only just like from the top down and all of that, but working with young people who have lived experiences that will get personally affected by these policies that we're talking about right now. So it's implementing or working with more grassroots
Hello, Basile, we may have lost her. I think it's a connection issue.
are the hardest to reach. They are the most vulnerable, and they are the most in need of all of these services that we are talking about here and all of this information that we are talking about. We are trying to get to reach them. So it's more focusing more on organizations that are there and making sure that their work gets out there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our questions, but just quickly before I hand over, a big thank you from me as the moderator for all of your reflections, thoughts, and your time, and most importantly, your work and your ongoing advocacy. It's my pleasure now to welcome for our closing remarks, Mr. Arthur Erkin, Director for UNFPA's Policy and Strategy Division. Arthur, thank you for being with us here today. Hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I know you've been listening. I'm going to hand over to you now for some closing reflections from your side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laila. And let me start really by first thanking Gita, Eunice, Sarah, and Olobisili for really an inspiring ICPD 30 talk. And really also living up to that expectation that what we really need now is dialogue, is talking to each other, listening to each other, learning from each other, understanding each other also better. And that's important going forward. I was privileged to be a member of the ICPD Secretariat 30 years ago. So we have some veterans here, and the Secretariat, of course, was instrumental in drafting many of the text, including myself. So it's humbling 30 years later to reflect on that time as well. And I want to start by just making the argument that the ICPD agenda is a political agenda, and that we should never forget. It is a political debate, and women's bodies then, particularly, and women's bodies today are unfortunately political issues. And overcoming that is what's been always the main driver of the work of UNFPA. How can you make sure that women truly do get bodily autonomy? Because bodily autonomy is at the heart of the SRHR agenda. It's the simple question of who owns your body? Is it yourself, or is it someone else who makes decisions about your body? And it's that true liberation of women's bodies in particular, but not just women's, but any group, is at the heart of the ICPD. And in that sense, we have achieved a lot, but we are absolutely not there if still more than half the women do not have access to their own body, cannot make decisions about themselves, for themselves, about their lives and who they want to marry and who they want to have children with, etc., etc., etc. We still have a long way to go. And that, I think, is what probably the main message should be. And for that, of course, as Gita was saying, we need, of course, continue to have this intellectual capacity that we need to have, and the capital that we build up of the arguments that are there. But that we know now in this world is not enough. Evidence and arguments are not enough. It is about how we reach out to other groups. And one of the things that we in UNFPA focus a lot on is what we call the mushy middle. It's that middle group that is probably not at the barricades of this agenda, but is necessarily also not against it. And how do we broaden that tent? And I think Eunice was talking about, of course, cross movements. We need to bring other people in this conversation, to not making it an issue of SRHR in a corner, but really make it SRHR an issue of the broader dialogue on inequality, on climate change, on the rise in authoritarianism that we see all over. And that, I think, is really critical for all of us here to focus on. How do we decolonize the ICPD agenda? Because I do think, reflecting on that time, it was a unique time in the world. How often have we not told each other now that negotiating ICPD today would be impossible? Well, that means that it was a unique time. And it was, of course, a time of the end of the Cold War. All the conferences in the UN at that time were around the peace dividend. If some of us probably still remember, it was how we don't need all that money anymore for military because the Cold War has ended. How do we use that money for peace and for development? And it's in that context, of course, that we were able to do this. I often also reflect, and I remember a discussion in the Secretariat at that time. What if George Herbert Walker Bush, the president of the United States up until '92, was reelected, and we didn't have Bill Clinton and Al Gore in the White House? It would have been probably an interesting and a different kind of. So the political element of that time, that unique moment of that time, which allowed the voice of civil society to be in that conversation, I think is something we should never forget. And that's why it is so difficult today, because that atmosphere, as Gita was very much alluded to, has changed a lot. And as I've said to the executive director many times at that time, the opposition to ICPD started the day after the adoption. It was before that, but it has, of course, it was never not there. And I think that's where we need to continue to fight this battle. And as Gita was saying, rightly so, the struggle that was going into ICPD, that struggle has never, of course, been more difficult as it is probably today. And that's why I think, if I look back and hearing all what we hear from the panelists, the issues of rights and choices is still where we need to be. This is still an unwavering commitment that we all should have, and never give up on that. If we start to, give in on that, then of course we're nowhere. This fight about liberating women's bodies in particular, it should never be forgotten, and should still drive us to this day. I also do think, as I said, my second one was this issue of progress is not being made by talking to the converted. Progress is made by reaching out to those that are not yet converted, that need to be brought into this. This broadened intent is extremely important for this agenda. That's why, as I said, the ICPD 30 is all around dialogue. The whole logo is around the dialogue. You see that speech bubble that we have in the logo, and that's for a purpose. That realize that pushing people back in a corner and telling them that they are wrong and we are right doesn't really help much. But reaching out probably is what we need to do. Not giving in. Reaching out doesn't mean you give in on your agenda, but it means that you open up your arms and saying, let me talk to you. Let me try to understand why you are against certain things. And let me try to reason with you in a way that hopefully brings you in at least closer to where we are. So with this, there's a lot that is at stake in ICPD 30. The UN is discussing, of course, not just in the Commission on Population Development, a new political declaration, but more importantly, the UN is discussing, of course, the Summit of the Future, which really starts to outline how the member states of the United Nations see the main issues before them in the next decade, and will probably also drive the next development agenda. So it is very important for all of us here in this conversation that we are, one, we're very aligned and clear-eyed on what we want to achieve, and making sure that these issues are certainly reflected in whatever comes out of the Summit of the Future, particularly the Pact of the Future, which will be the main document. And so this conversation fits very much into that. Certainly UNFPA will take this forward in both the CPD, but also, of course, in the discussion on the Summit of the Future, because that's very important. Because as many of you have said, including of course Gita, the opposition is not sitting still. They will try to do everything to make sure that these issues are not being reflected. So I call upon all of us to stay vigilant and active, and keep on fighting the good fight for rights and choices of people, of making sure that these issues do stay front and center of the overall sustainable development agenda, and that through that we are making progress and continue to make progress in the end, living up to the spirit of ICPD, which was really ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And of course, well, we hope also for sexual rights, which is a difficult issue still in the United Nations. And that gives me to the last point, and I think this is why this conversation is so important around bodily autonomy. When we were thinking about the ICPD 25, one of the main issues was, how do we get traction on sexual rights? And that's where the issue of bodily autonomy came in the Nairobi statement, because we were saying, how do you try to get to members to be less offended almost by the word sexual rights? And we said, well, why don't we just say that what's at the heart is, of course, your bodily autonomy and the right on your own body, and who can be against that? Even one who opposes sexual rights, you could say, well, do you want someone else to say something about how you behave? Probably not. Well, that's bodily autonomy. So I hope we'll continue to push this issue forward. It is so important, and for me, it's almost the final frontier in this battle, that everyone has a right to its own body and to decide for him or herself what it wants to do. And with that, Laila, let me thank you. Let me thank everyone on this call for being part of it. Please keep the conversation going. It is so important. It's not the beginning. It's certainly we're going to continue with this conversation. But also, let's just make sure that we are never giving up on this fight. Don't be despaired, because in those 30 years, as Gita and Sarah will all say, a lot has changed for the better. And many people will say that I was a rep at one point in a country in South Asia, and I always asked my local staff, the women of the local staff, I said, are you better off, you think, now than your grandmothers and your mothers? And almost all of them said, yes, we're better off. We're not there yet, but we're better off than our grandmothers and our mothers were. So let's keep up that good fight in the end. And let's, as we say in UNFPA, let's climb the mountaintop. And in the end, when we're at the top and we look down, we see a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. And let's work towards that vision. Thank you.